Hey, greetings. This is Daniel Jenkins, the Executive Director of the Slave Society's Digital Archive. In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience working on the Slave Society's project, and I'm going to use it as a case study as part of a larger discussion about building digital collections and making them useful to as large an audience as possible. If you have gotten to this video as part of the 2020 Vanderbilt Center for Digital Humanities Bootcamp, welcome. If you found it through other means, the Slave Society's Digital Archive is, as you might suspect by now, a digital humanities project at Vanderbilt University. And in either case, we're going to learn a little bit more about the project in the next 10 minutes or so. Very briefly, in this video, I'm going to start by talking about the archive and its data, with a brief history of the project and a little bit more of an in-depth explanation in the kind of documents we work with and how we digitize them. Then I'm going to talk about transforming this data, and that is digital images, into an archive and the various strategies that we've used to do that over the years. And then finally, once we have the archive in place, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we go about analyzing the data that is in the archive and making it public and accessible and useful, again, to as many people as possible. One other note, this is a super dense slide deck. There's a lot of information in the slides. Don't really worry about reading along as I talk. Focus more on what I'm saying. If you're seeing this video through the bootcamp, there will be a link to the slide deck in the Brightspace module, and if you found it on YouTube, there will be a link to the slide deck on the YouTube page. So with that in mind, here we go. So as of giving this talk, there are over 500,000 images that make up this collection and that are available online in the URL that you see there, slavesocieties.org. This project has been in existence for more than 15 years. It started out being conceived of as a one-off project to digitize early modern historical records in Cuba and Brazil that contain information about the lives of people of African descent in those places. Initially, the project focused on ecclesiastical records, that is to say, baptismal, marriage, and burial records typically generated by the Catholic Church. But more recently, we've also added some secular records, including notarial, legal, and political documents. As of, again, giving this talk in summer 2020, there are more than 700,000 images in the collection in its entirety, coming from more than close to 3,000 volumes. This slide here gives you a very brief taste of our experience over the years. You see a couple of the project teams. As well, in the upper right corner, an image we like to show a lot about why we need to save these documents. That is Cuba during Hurricane Irma in a street where one of our Cuban archives is located. And that just kind of is an image that really emphasizes the really imminent threat to a lot of these documents, to the physical documents themselves. And that's why we want to digitize them, to make sure that the history that they tell us about is preserved. Our records come from a lot of places. The places you see in the slide here, places are Cuba, Colombia, the United States, Brazil, and Cape Verde. In addition, we are always adding new projects. We have new projects spinning up in Mexico, Guatemala, and Angola as well right now. One of the most noteworthy things about these records, as we think about building digital collections and how difficult or easy that is these are historical documents. They have not always been preserved in the best way possible. Again, that's why it's important to save them, but it also means that they can be hard to save. And these images give you a little bit of a sense of what the documents that we work with look like. The last thing that I want to talk about in this very brief introduction to the Slave Society's project is how we actually go about digitizing these records. I'm not going to go into any detail about this because, as you might imagine, it's a pretty involved process. If you want to learn more about this, I will include links to more resources about digitization either on the YouTube page or in the Brightspace module. But I will say, if you look at the image on this slide, that is a pretty good sense for what our typical setup look like. We use digital cameras with tripods. solid color backdrops, things of that nature, and most of all, we typically digitize in accordance to the standards of the British Library, which is an organization that we've worked with a lot over the years, and they're very exacting, rigorous standards, as you might imagine. So once we have the digital images that make up the data of this archive, how do we go about turning them into something that is safe, both in terms of preservation and in terms of accessibility? So there are three main goals when we think about managing the data that we have. Number one, of course, it needs to be organized in a clear and predictable manner. We need to know what we have and where it is. Second, in terms of storage, both archival and production copies of the data. And the distinction there is just based on the resolution of the image. So the resolution of an image we want people to actually share on the internet is not necessarily the same as like the super high resolution image that we keep for our own purposes and to have as lossless an image as possible. But regardless, all those should be stored using secure, reliable, and affordable technology. And then finally, indexable metadata. And metadata is just data about data. So when you load up a library webpage and you see you click into a book and you see the name of the book and the author and the publication date, etc. That's metadata. And similarly, we want metadata like that for all the volumes in our collection, so users can browse our archive intuitively and also search specifically for things if they know what they're looking for. There's a lot of challenges, even just to meet those three simple goals. When I first came to the project, our data was stored fairly haphazardly and unpredictably in external hard drives and some physical storage locally at Vanderbilt. In terms of that storage, it had been stored locally at Vanderbilt, as I said, but more recently the Vanderbilt Library, which had been extremely gracious in its support for the project over the years, realized that the size of our project had continued to grow, and they could no longer support further expansion of the project, so we had to come up with our own way of continuing to store new records. Again, I want to stress the library held on to everything it's always held on to before. And then finally, in terms of the metadata, again, several years ago when I first started working on the project, more than a third of the collection had no metadata whatsoever. And the metadata that did exist was exclusively in the form of flat Excel files, which didn't necessarily lend itself to easily being imported into any kind of software that we would use to actually make the collection accessible. So what did we do to kind of address these problems? The first thing that I did to really kind of get the data organized was to realize that I didn't want to do it all by hand, right? When you're dealing with thousands and thousands or tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of files, you don't want to do anything manually, or you want to do as little manually as possible. And even if you have a much smaller project, I would argue the same holds true. The solution that I used to address this problem was to automate a lot of the kind of basic file organization tasks using simple scripting, using basic programming. The code here is written in a multi-purpose programming language called Python, which is the one I've used. There are others. Python's a good choice. You'll be able to learn more about Python later in the week in this bootcamp, and you'll also be able to learn a little bit more about Jupyter Notebooks, which is a method that I use to organize the code that I wrote to reorganize all of our records. I'm proud to say that the final result of this process was a fairly well organized collection that was fully inventoried, so we knew exactly what we had and where it was. And you see there, a little bit over 10,000 lines of code to make that work. It certainly wasn't the best code, and I want to stress while we're talking about programming, programming may seem like something that's really scary and unapproachable, but you can really start programming with very little knowledge whatsoever, and you can actually get a lot done with very little knowledge, and I will, make myself the very first example of that fact. So the last thing, or the second thing we needed was metadata, right? Information about these records to make them searchable and browsable. Again, my guiding principle here was to keep things as simple as possible, to do as much as we could with the limited resources we had access to, right? And I think that is definitely a relatable situation across the board in the humanities and certainly in the digital humanities. Another constraint, given that this was a project that other members of the Slave Society's team were working on, is that a lot of folks aren't comfortable with super technically complex solutions, and that's totally okay. And in fact, that's a good thing in some ways, because it really forces us to develop solutions that are accessible to a lot of people. And frankly, these solutions so often end up being easier and better than a more complex solution would have been anyway. So the way that we went about building metadata ultimately was using Google Forms. I'm sure many of you have interacted with a Google form before. I think maybe even to sign up for the Vanderbilt Bootcamp you did. And it's very simple. You click a link, you click through some questions, and you save it, right? What may not be quite as obvious is that behind that Google form lives a spreadsheet. So any Google form, with the click of a button, you can turn into a spreadsheet. And once you have a spreadsheet, which is structured data, very simple structured data, with just a little bit more work, you can turn that into really kind of any data format that you want. So basically, again, once we had a spreadsheet with hundreds and hundreds of lines worth of volume metadata, I wrote another Python script that converted that metadata into metadata in the form that was required for our content management system, which I'll get to in a second. But again, using that process, we were able to build out metadata for the entire collection in a single academic year at very low cost. So the last thing is storage. There's a lot of different ways you can store your data. You can store it on external hard drives. You can store it locally with your university or your organization, or you can store it in the cloud. There are pros and cons associated with all three of those strategies. Our ultimate solution in the past year has been to go to the cloud to store our data with Amazon. Again, there are pros and cons, but for us, the pros really outweigh the cons. The storage in the cloud is extremely safe and secure. It's fairly easy to access and manipulate the data. Obviously, the costs are, the literal financial costs. But for us, at the scale of our data, those costs are manageable. And regardless of the size of your project, it's very important to think about storing your data somewhere where it's safe and secure, while also obviously keeping in mind the resources available to the project. And again, as of this talk, there are close to 20 terabytes of data stored in Amazon S3. That probably sounds like a lot in the scheme of the humanities, and I guess in some ways it is, but in the broad scheme of the world, that's a drop in the bucket. But data is good. Data, I definitely feel strongly about the importance of good data and storing good data securely. So the last thing that I want to talk about really briefly here is how we go about analyzing and sharing this data and metadata once we have it all stored. So the first thing that we needed was a digital repository in which to store this data, and more specifically, these tools not only store the data, but also provide components that allow projects to publicize that data on the internet. There's a fair amount of choices in this space. The one that we chose is called Islandora. I always love this hamburger visual. Credit to Dale Poulter from the library for it originally. But it gives you an idea of what's called the software stack of Islandora, and definitely don't get bogged down in the specifics of the components you see there, the buns and the condiments and the burger itself. But what it does help to illustrate is there's a bunch of different software components, even in as something theoretically simple as a piece of software that stores data and indexes it, makes it searchable, and then makes it accessible on the internet. But Islandora is the one that we have used for the Slave Societies project as of August 2020, when this talk is being recorded. So with that specifics in mind, I want to zoom a little back out again and talk briefly about how we go from preservation to usability. And I want to make it super clear that preservation in and of itself is critically important. For many, many years, the Slave Societies project was focused almost exclusively on preservation, and in the course of that time, we digitize thousands and thousands of volumes, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of images containing information that is not only super opaque in kind of the mainstream historical record, but is at critical risk. Again, just think back to that picture from earlier in the talk of the flooded street in Havana. However, it's not necessarily enough, or it's only part of the challenge to just preserve that information and store it safely, right? We actually want to make the information in those documents accessible to as many people as possible. And there are challenges, because these are all, or mostly all, handwritten documents in languages other than English. They're difficult to read to start with, even for native speakers of those languages. The documents, as we saw earlier, aren't necessarily themselves in great shape. Particularly images taken early in the project aren't themselves necessarily always the best. And for a researcher looking for something specifically, again, the collection itself is very large. So we need a way of really directing them to the information that is of the most interest to them. So there's many, many different things that we can do to address it, but what I'm going to talk a little bit about in the time remaining here is a few of those. The first thing that is very important whenever you're dealing with a large set of fairly diverse data like we have are, building controlled vocabularies for your data. And that means, when I'm talking about something like you see here in the slide of the ages of individuals that appear in these records, we want to have specific categories so that we can make connections across the collection. There are a lot of projects that are working towards these types of initiatives, towards what's called linked data, which is not only controlling vocabularies within projects, but across projects, so that we can really maximize the value of our data. Now you may notice that kind of the controlled vocabularies we're talking about here are at the level of individuals, whereas the metadata we were talking about before was at the level of volumes. So this kind of gets to the final point that I want to make in this talk, which is talking about moving from the volume level metadata, which is great and maybe gets people to the right volume, to actually learning more about what's inside the volumes, about what's really important, which is the individuals that appear in these records. So the images that you see here are from a piece of software called the Spatial Historian that another postdoc on the Slave Societies project named Jim Schindling has been developing for us. And what this tool is basically a series of interfaces that make it easier for us as the researchers to extract more detailed information about people and places and events that appear in our records and store them in a structured way. And the structured way in this case is what's called a SQL database. You can basically imagine a SQL database as many flat Excel spreadsheets stacked on top of each other and connected to each other. But again, what this software does, rather than just literally typing data out into tens or dozens or hundreds of spreadsheets, is it provides interfaces that allow the researcher to intuitively label the data and put it in the right place, and then at the click of the button store that data in a SQL database where it belongs. So okay, that's still kind of labor intensive, right? It still doesn't really get past the challenge of the researcher having to be in front of the computer manually processing all of the data that they want to make public, make accessible as part of their project. So where we're going with this, and where we've just started working right now, is machine learning. And machine learning towards the end of having computers help us, or even completely automate the process of extracting this information from these records, making not only building this individual level metadata, but also building transcriptions, which we've always done manually to this point, or even being able to produce those transcriptions from images without any further intervention, right? That's kind of the third step of the three steps you see here. So the first thing that we think about is, if we do have these transcriptions already made by humans, maybe we can train a computer to extract information about people, places, and events from them. And then maybe once we can do that, once we just have the images, we can at least get the people, places, and events, even if we can't get the full transcriptions. And then finally, the last step is, actually producing the transcriptions from the raw images. This is all still a work in process. We're just really getting started on it. But, hopefully if you come back for Bootcamp 2021, we'll have some real results to show here. But regardless, when you're talking about a collection at the size of ours, it's really not viable to do a lot of these things manually at scale. The ultimate solution will be automated, whether it's now or in 5 or 10 years. So I know that was a ton. This has gone longer than I intended it to. Hopefully it was intelligible. Hopefully you got something out of it. I do want to say, again, don't be overwhelmed if you're just getting into the digital humanities. What you saw here was a product of, of years of kind of getting going with the project and learning the tools that are out there. And really, this is a fairly complicated project with a lot of moving parts to start with. Hopefully you got a taste of, smaller specific things that might be more of use to you, kind of parts of our process that might be like your whole process. So please, if you want to learn more about the project, come visit us at slavesocieties.org. And if you have any questions about the project or this talk, please reach out to me. And I'd be glad to talk more about the project. It's something that I'm really enthusiastic about. And that I think this project and I think digital humanities more generally are, more important now than ever in a world of the coronavirus. But I think we can also do some really amazing things, and I'm looking forward to be a part of that. Thanks for listening.